So let's briefly look through the 4 key stages of a project. Obviously you have to start it, then you have to organize and prepare. So starting is not just getting stuck into the work. Starting is getting the planning part ready to go. It's formally saying this project is starting on the 20th of April. It's organizing and preparing is the next step. So you're feeding into the kickoff with how you're actually going to do the work. In purple here we actually have the activity. Now, embedded in that is monitoring and, you know, all of those normal quality activities that we would do, and then finally we'll finish the project and we'll close off the project. So let's look at those in more detail. So if we're starting the project, we're essentially almost at the pre-project stage. So we're trying to figure out why are we doing this in the first place, and we're not looking at this point to create a very, very detailed plan. We're just looking at high-level material. So we're trying to figure out, well, why am I doing this? Roughly what am I going to do? So let's take this in the context of your research project and even the assignment that you have to do for the research methods module. So if we take that idea of starting the project, you're just figuring out, well, what will I be doing as part of my research project? So what is the need that I have to fulfill? Well, I need to do a project that will get me the marks, but hopefully you want to address some scientific or technical or other need that is within the context of your workplace. Now, this is not when you need a fully detailed plan. This is something that you just want to have the beginnings of. You want to kind of look at the high-level aims of the project. So think what are the goals. Now we'll talk about objectives in the next part, but you're really looking at goals here, the overall aims. I am going to do A. I am going to do A and B. It should be fairly brief. You don't want to have loads of layers of this, and resist the temptation to go into too many layers, because that's actually quite difficult. And we'll talk about that later on when we talk about work breakdown structures. But really this is almost like brainstorming. You're just fleshing out the rough idea, the trajectory of the project, what am I going to do, roughly what the timeline is, that kind of stuff. It's just the framework, if you want to look at it like that. Once we have this broad aim specified, we can move on to a more detailed planning step. And in that we're really looking at defining what are the key measurable outputs that we'll actually have, and also how do we achieve those. So in the context of your project, you have the aim, which is a high-level view, and then you have objectives. And this is really where you're going to break down those objectives, because each objective should give you an output. If you achieve a certain objective, that will give you an output. So if we take the example of baking bread, and baking the loaf of bread is your aim, so let's take a couple of objectives within that. So one objective is making the dough. One objective is accumulating the ingredients for the dough. One objective is ensuring the oven is at the right temperature. So each one of those has a defined output or result. So it's almost like something you can tick off and say, yes, the oven is at 200 degrees. It's also a list of what needs to be done. And when you're doing this, there's another video coming which has a bit more detail on this. But when you are doing the list of what needs to be done, you have to bear in mind the expertise of the people who are doing the project. So if you are a medical scientist or a scientist with experience in a laboratory and are doing a laboratory-based project, you don't have to explain to the same level as you would if you had someone who walked in off the street into the laboratory. You can assume a certain level of knowledge and expertise. So if you need to tell someone to do something, you don't need to micromanage them, you just need to give them their objective and let them go and figure out what's underneath that objective. Okay, so they're off to solve that problem, to come out with the result or output for you, but you're not telling them the 57 steps that need to be done. Just say, okay, I need that done by next week. Let them off. That's why they're professionals. The detailed plan also obviously has to have the timeline, the cost, what are the resources, etc., etc. So this planning part can actually take a while. It is possible to get lost in this and over-plan, so you just plan and plan and plan and never get anything done. So you have to be somewhat sensible about it. And you do need to identify the level of detail that's right for your context. Now it may be different depending on your laboratory, the scope of the project, the nature of the people involved, etc., etc. But at the end of this, you should have a fairly detailed plan that lists out your objectives, the timeline for achieving each of those objectives, and how they actually feed back into achieving that primary aim. And then you actually have to go and do the work. So it's not just what you're doing yourself, but it's also if you need to establish a project team. Now in the context of your research project, you probably won't have a project team. You may have other people involved with you that could be looked at like a project team. So your supervisor or a clinical person who's helping you get samples and so on. You do need to have some way to monitor and control how things are going. So meetings, documentation saying, well, we've achieved A, B, and C aims and we're still working on D. You need to ensure the standards are high, and you need to try and use all of those things to keep it on track. So you're doing the work, someone who is controlling the project or managing the project is making sure that all of the individual players in the project are doing something so that they're generating results and outputs, but they're also checking that the standards are correct, and they're making sure that people are not drifting and the scope is not drifting off in different ways, and they're also ensuring that the risk is reduced. For example, the risk of not completing the project on time, not completing the project at all, or even spending too much money on the project. And it's really in this phase that you actually generate those outputs, you achieve those objectives. And then at the end, we need to figure out how we stop that project. So we'll have feedback from anyone that's involved in it. If we were baking the bread for someone, they have to approve the loaf of bread and say, okay, that's a good enough loaf of bread for me. We might have to do a bit of reflection and evaluate the project. So how did we get on with the project? What did we learn from doing this project? Is there anything that we could do differently next time? And so on. So that's kind of the formal close-off of the project. Now, regardless of how long each of those phases take, it might be tiny, it might be very long, but all projects have those stages. They could be a couple of days, they could be a couple of hours even, or it could be months of planning before you get involved in a very, very large piece of work. Often the first two phases will be kind of overlapped and merge into one another, but it can be useful to formally break them down. And just real world issues where the funding is pulled when you're halfway through the project. So you started off having 10,000 euros, now you have 3,000 euros. You have to go back and readjust the scope. You have to go to the person who's overseeing the project and say, well, we don't have enough money now to complete that project that you wanted, so we have to change the project in essence. So you can be forced back to kind of go through the cycles again. But ideally you're trying to avoid that, and this could be one of the reasons. Not every project can work, and it can be difficult to say no to a project, but it's probably better and more effective to say no because you're fairly sure that this project can't be achieved. I'm not to say that the project shouldn't be ambitious, but if you were asked to do something that you knew patently was impossible with the resources you have available, so you're asked to bring a new test into the lab and do 2,000 tests a day with no extra staff, you can't do it. It's just not doable. If somebody said, well, we need this done and we'll provide an extra staff member and some extra money for the lab, maybe that becomes something that's doable. Is that challenging? Absolutely, but it might be possible. So it's better not to start a project that you know is going to fail, I suppose, is the take-home message really. So all of those stages about starting, organizing, doing the work and finishing the work are supported by a couple of different things. They're supported by processes that kind of help keep those flow. So we need processes to kick things off, where we're communicating with all of the stakeholders in the project, where we're ensuring that the right doors are opened to complete the project, that we have someone who's sponsoring the project, and we'll talk about that again later, that we have processes that push the project through. So we'll have those planning processes we meant, we have those executing, so that's the doing processes. So you can see the kind of four phases highlighted. here before, where we're starting, we're organizing and preparing, we're carrying out the work, and then we're closing out the project. So the commitment of the individuals involved in the project, high level communication, and making sure that information is distributed evenly and transparently as needed. Probably out of all of those, communication is the key one, because if you have someone off working away thinking they're doing the right thing because they haven't been communicated with properly, you have a lot of wasted effort, a challenged if not failed project. And you could add into that communications, make something about managing expectations. You may need to manage what someone expects of the project. They might think it's going to be the all singing, all dancing project. You know it's not, because that's just not achievable. So the take-home messages from these videos are: there's a 4-stage life cycle. We're starting off, we're organizing and preparing, we're doing the project and performing it, and then we're closing off the project. That is the key piece that you need to think about, those 4 stages. And those stages are supported by those processes we mentioned earlier. So the kickoff, the initiation, the planning part, the executing part, the monitoring and controlling, which is part of execution, and performing. So performing, executing and monitoring all kind of live in the same environment. And then the last part then is closing off. So those processes in blue support those elements of the life cycle.